Hello, I'm Daniel Byman, the Director of the Warfare, Irregular Threats, and Terrorism Program here at CSIS. And today we're discussing whether Ukraine can fight without U.S. support. I'm here with my CSIS colleagues. To my left is Riley McCabe. Across from me is Iselin Brady. And next to her is Alexander Palmer. I really want to begin with you, Riley, with a very basic question. Let's put a baseline in. What types of military support is the United States currently providing to Ukraine?
Sure. Well, the U.S. is providing all different types of military support. And in fact, the term Ukraine aid that you'll hear repeatedly throughout this event is itself a catch-all term. It's not just military support that the U.S. is giving Ukraine. The U.S. is also giving economic assistance, humanitarian assistance. It's making investments in Ukraine's reconstruction. But in terms of military assistance, there's a lot going on. So it's not just equipment. There's also intelligence support. The U.S. is providing training for Ukrainian soldiers. There's also some operational planning going on and plenty of equipment being transferred to Ukraine. And that's where I want to draw our attention to this first graphic, where you can see all different types of equipment that the U.S. has given Ukraine, including a couple that I want to call out because of their importance on the battlefield. The first is the U.S. has given over 3 million 155 millimeter artillery rounds. We've given Patriot air defense systems. We've given over 1,000 MRAPs, that's mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, which have proven important on the battlefield as Ukraine is increasingly mined by both Russia and Ukraine in defense of their territory. And what I want to end on here is just that there are a few factors really that dictate what aid the U.S. gives Ukraine. The first is Ukraine's battlefield needs. So the artillery shells, the 3 million that I just pointed out, Ukraine needs that because they're expending reportedly thousands of shells per day in defense against waves of Russian attacks. The other factor that dictates it is U.S. stockpiles. At the start of the war, we gave Ukraine thousands of javelins. Those are anti-tank missiles. We depleted our own stockpiles in the U.S., giving those javelins to Ukraine, and it takes years to replenish those. So we've actually stopped giving them javelins more recently because we need some for ourselves. And the last factor is escalation. There were concerns about escalation, how Ukraine may use some of the aid that we give them. So, for example, ATACMS, which are Army tactical missile systems capable of striking deep within Russia. Ukraine asked for those for over a year before the Biden administration actually gave them to them. So those are some of the factors that dictate, what we give. And as you can see from this figure, we've given a lot of military equipment to Ukraine.
Let's focus a bit on a cutoff. A cutoff can mean lots of different things, but if there were to be a cutoff, what sort of things do you think are likely to be cut off?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say exactly what this administration may decide is important and should stay or what it wants to go. The worst case scenario for Ukraine, at least, is that all U.S. aid is halted. And in that worst case scenario, what the U.S. could do is reach its arm across the Atlantic and tell Europe that it cannot transfer a U.S.-made equipment through third-party transfers to Ukraine. So in this worst case scenario, the U.S. has stopped giving aid, but it's also told Europe, you cannot give your U.S.-made equipment to Ukraine either. I don't think that worst case scenario is all that likely given the current trajectory we're on and certainly the signals coming from this administration. But that would be bleak for Ukraine. It wouldn't be the end necessarily of all U.S. aid to Ukraine, though, because, and I want to draw our attention to figure one here on the screen. There are a few different mechanisms that the U.S. uses to give Ukraine aid, and I want to focus on two. And this is oversimplified, but one is the Presidential Drawdown Authority, the PDA, which pulls from existing U.S. stockpiles. That is a rapid delivery mechanism. So from the decision to give Ukraine aid to battlefield deliveries is about 8 months if we're using the PDA.
This is rapid in U.S. government terms.
Right, yeah, certainly. The other mechanism that the U.S. can use is the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And that is where the federal government contracts with defense manufacturers here in the U.S. to build new systems. And that takes several years from the decision to give Ukraine aid to actual battlefield deliveries. And what we're seeing is that actually the contracts, the US AI contracts signed just at the start of the war, are now making battlefield deliveries. And what this figure shows us is that there will be deliveries to Ukraine for years to come into 2028 through US AI.
Iselin, can I ask you to kind of expand on some of these points? I know you've thought a lot about not just a cutoff in general, but a worst case situation. What sort of things might you be looking for to say that this isn't just a normal cutoff, this is actually more than at least might currently be expected?
Yes, well, and adding on to Riley's point, I think one thing that also needs to be considered is whether the US would cut off or decrease the amount of intelligence that it shares with Ukraine. If it were to remove intelligence sharing, the other question to ask is, would NATO members be allowed to share intelligence from the United States with Ukraine? And specifically, would they be allowed to share tactical details? So that is something that also needs to be considered when we ask, how much might the US cut off?
And I'll add on that one particular issue on the intelligence side are deep strikes into Russia. And by deep strikes, I mean away from the immediate battlefield. So some of it can be, dozens of kilometers, but some of it might be hundreds of kilometers. And as you can imagine, the intelligence picture gets harder and harder for Ukraine the deeper into Russia you go. So removing the US capabilities there is going to be very limiting if that happens. Sandra, let me turn to you. One of the big questions everyone is asking is, sure, the United States might be out completely or at least reducing its role, but Europe is talking big. They're talking about stepping up. Can you talk us through what that might mean?
So, look, in theory, Europe has a lot that they can do here. I mean, Europe has a large number of serious defense manufacturers. I mean, 2021 data, UK's BAE Systems brought in more revenue than Russia's Rostec. BAE is just one of the many firms in Europe. EU GDP, 20 trillion compared to Russia's 2 trillion. They added $2.6 trillion in manufacturing in 2023 compared to Russia's 230 billion. Just huge productive capacity. But they haven't really taken advantage of this because of lots of obstacles, sort of legal, procedural, political. The EU and Britain have not kind of really brought production online. So Riley talked about the US burning through its stockpiles. The EU, the UK have really done similar things. They drew down stocks of ammunition very early in the conflict. They turned to the international market to continue buying and supplying. But now they have to step up their own production. I mean, we look at what they've provided here and you see, look, MiG fighter jets, T-72 tanks. These are Russian systems. They're not kind of domestic European systems. So Europe really needs to bring up production if it's going to try and replace some of that US aid.
Iselin, let me ask you on Ukraine itself. One thing that at least has surprised me is Ukraine's ability to increase its own production, at least on some systems. Where can Ukraine fill holes and where can't it?
Yeah, so Ukraine currently produces about 30% of the military equipment that they require in this conflict. And that includes cruise missiles, drones, tanks, and ammunition. And this percentage is likely to increase, especially as Ukraine is seeking to establish joint ventures with companies from various European states. Two notable examples for Ukraine's ability to really innovate in its defense industry is first its drone innovation, which has been talked about significantly. In 2024, Ukrainian manufacturers produced 2 million drones, and this was especially impressive as their original goal for the year was just set at 1 million originally. And Ukraine has used drones extensively throughout this conflict, most recently and most notably in their Spider's Web operation on June 1st, where they were able to target 4 key Russian military air bases. The second example of Ukraine's ability to innovate is in their ammunition and mortar production. So they went basically between 2023 and 2024 from producing 1 million rounds every year to being able to produce 2.5 million, which is a 150% increase. Very impressive. However, Ukraine does still rely on foreign assistance for about 70% of its military equipment. And there are several examples where Ukraine just will not be able to increase its production capacity enough in order to be able to produce the number of weapons or equipment that it requires. And there have actually been some very interesting cases where Ukrainian manufacturers have stated that they would be able to increase their production capacity. However, what is hindering them is a lack of state funding. And one other important note to make is that because Ukraine is in an active conflict, its weapons manufacturing facilities are at an increased risk of being targeted, which is something that we have seen as well. So all of this is going to hinder or decrease, although it will not prevent Ukraine from being able to increase its production and being able to continue to innovate.
And one point I'll highlight on Iselin's review is what Riley mentioned at the beginning of our talk, which was how some of the U.S. systems necessary for air defense are going to be lacking, and that puts Ukraine's production facilities at greater risk.
Can I jump in here?
Of course.
I want to hammer home one point that Iselin just made, which is the operation this past weekend where Ukraine struck deep inside Russia using this drone hidden inside containers, planned over 18 months, really demonstrates how, even with limited resources, a smaller population, a smaller fighting population to mobilize than Russia, a smaller defense industrial base than Russia, and obviously bolstered by Western support. But Ukraine has been able to have outsized strategic impact even with its limited resources. And I think the operation over the weekend is case in point, how effective Ukraine has been despite limitations on its defense industrial base.
So I'll highlight that operation and use it to go to another question I have. One thing about that operation to me was not only did it show the ability to hurt the Russian military forces, but it was a real morale boost. It was a way of Ukraine saying we're still in this fight, that we can reach deep into Russia. It had repercussions outside Ukraine. Xander, let me ask you this question, which is, there's a cutoff and we spent a lot of time talking about particular systems, but what does it mean for the morale of the Ukrainians and the broader, I'll say, politics of this decision?
Look, I mean, the real answer is that we don't really know. The Ukrainians have fought against overwhelming odds kind of early on in the conflict with very little support. They're defending their homeland, and we definitely don't want to count them out. I think it's probably unlikely that the Ukrainians collapse due to a cutoff in U.S. aid. But at the end of the day, we don't know, right? It's impossible to measure will to fight, and it's impossible to kind of sharply predict the impacts of a decision like this. So, deciding to cut off aid does accept that risk that the Ukrainians kind of run low on ammunition, feel that they're not being supported, feel like they're unable to hold the line, and you could see kind of a domino effect.
So I'll highlight some other CSIS research that talks about the incredibly slow rate of Russian advance, this kind of grinding sound-like conflict that Riley was one of the authors on. But what I would also point out is these grinding war of attritions. We saw this in World War I. We saw this with the Iran-Iraq War. Sometimes they end with one side collapsing, often due to morale. So even as we're watching the day-to-day military balance change, we need to be thinking about the broader morale of the combatants. One issue that I wanted to highlight as well is thinking about this as a broader competition outside Ukraine. And there's sometimes too much made of how this is a conflict not just between Ukraine and Russia, but between democracy and authoritarianism. But one of the big shifts we have seen after 2022 is growing cooperation between Russia and especially China, but also Iran and North Korea, with North Koreans fighting and dying in large numbers in Ukraine, with Iranian systems, drone systems playing a huge role in combat, and Russia providing massive amounts of economic assistance and components that have enabled Russia to stay in the fight. There is a question of whether a U.S. cutoff would be sending a message, and I'll say the wrong message, to the world and to these countries, that they would say, look, by sticking together, by fighting, we endured, and the United States will eventually quit. And the United States may not want to send that message, not just in Ukraine itself, but also outside the region, especially in Asia, where the Trump administration claims it's focusing its attention, but this could be sending a very dangerous message there. I want to conclude by asking just a very big question of really everyone, which is, how do we think about this cutoff mattering in terms of the balance of forces in Ukraine? We've talked about lots of different aspects of this, but what would you want to leave our viewers with? Riley, let me start with you.
Sure. Well, I want to emphasize that this question comes down to what is the scope of the cutoff? Is it we give less military equipment? Is it our humanitarian assistance declines? Is it we cut off intelligence support like we saw for a brief period in early March? The answer to how damaging our cutoff will be to Ukraine is entirely dependent on what we decide to cut. And I would emphasize what Iselin said earlier, that our intelligence support to Ukraine has been particularly vital in enabling long-range strikes, as well as air defense. Satellite imagery that the U.S. intelligence community provides to Ukraine shows real-time reconnaissance of have these Russian bombers taken off from an air base and where are they headed. So not just for offensive operations, but also for protecting Ukrainian civilians. U.S. intelligence support is incredibly vital. And even the loss of just one component like that could seriously degrade the fight and cost Ukrainian lives. So it will come down to, for me, the scope of what we see, if anything.
Sandra, please.
Yeah, stepping back from the battlefield for a minute, I think something that's important to think about is the message this sends to Vladimir Putin, and kind of how it affects Russian strategic thinking about the potential for victory in the war versus the kind of desirability of a negotiated outcome. Right? President Trump has said he wants a negotiated outcome in Ukraine. But I suspect, although I can't prove, that the Russians see a key center of gravity here as being U.S. political will. They think that if the United States ceases support, then they will eventually win the war. I think that President Trump has an opportunity to send a strong message to President Putin by continuing aid, by doubling down on the commitment, and disabusing the Russians of this notion that all they have to do is outlast a U.S. presidential administration if they want to roll into Kyiv.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I want to put a point on this issue, which is as the conditions are now, where the U.S. is giving aid and has been giving aid for the past several years, the Russians have not been able to break through. Obviously, in their initial invasion, they made it very close to Kyiv, and the Ukrainians were able to push them back in key areas. But the front lines have not moved significantly in the past year and a half about. So under the current conditions, Putin cannot reasonably expect to conquer all of Ukrainian territory if the U.S. continues giving aid. At least that's our assessment in our recent report that you referenced. So it really is leverage at the table for Putin if the U.S. support is wavering.
Iselin, what's your final takeaway for our viewers?
Yes. I would say in addition to just what a potential U.S. cutoff could look like and what the scope of that would be, another important thing to keep in mind is just Ukraine's very impressive ability to become adaptable and to innovate. They have shown an ability to rapidly increase their production and engage in very important tactical innovations that have allowed them to continue in this conflict.
I think it's important here not to forget, though, that the Russians have also been innovative. There's this kind of image of David versus Goliath, and I think at times there's this temptation to think that the Ukrainians can kind of innovate themselves out of a weaker position, but a lot of recent innovation has been on the Russian side. I mean, UMPK glide bombs have allowed the Russian Air Force to kind of enter the fight in a way that it hadn't been before. Use of fiber optic cables to pilot unmanned aerial systems in, electromagnetically denied environments. Those are Russian innovations, and we can't, we want the Ukrainians probably to innovate their way out of some of their problems, but we can't depend on it. Kind of continued support, kind of large amounts of materiel is irreplaceable.
I'll give my last thoughts really about Europe. This is a moment, maybe even the moment, for Europe to show that it can be a serious security actor on its own. And there's a lot of talk about increasing defense spending overall. There's a lot of strong rhetoric on behalf of Ukraine, but we will see 6 months from now, a year from now, just how much is actually done. Unfortunately, Europe has a pretty long history of talking big on these issues and not delivering. There is a genuine chance of change right now, but to me, this is one of the big factors that at least I don't know the answer to. I would like to thank everyone for joining us. You can find our report, Can Ukraine Fight Without U.S. Aid?, on the CSIS website at csis.org.